My name is Ko. I am a CUSF Writing Center tutor, and today we're going to be doing a workshop on expository essays. I'll be using close reading as my example. So defining the terms. So expository essays are a genre of essays that explain, describe, or define a subject using factual evidence. It can easily be mistaken for an informative essay, which, as its title would suggest, informs the reader about a specific subject. Expository essays differ because they investigate an idea and the evidence behind it in order to bring forth an argument about said idea. So as I said in the beginning, I will be using close reading as my example. If I were to begin writing an introductory paragraph about close reading, the first thing I would want to do is define my terms. So close reading is a method of literary analysis that focuses on a media's details in order to discern a deeper meaning. And because this subject is nothing new, there are obviously going to be misconceptions tied to it that I should obviously address because it could work into my thesis. So some misconceptions about close reading is that it can only be applicable to texts and books, but not only that, it also is specifically tied to an academic setting. And I refute that point by basically saying the importance of it is to open our eyes to new perspective and discussions. So it's not simply limited to an academic setting. It could be used outside of the academic setting. Now that I've provided all that information in the introductory paragraph, it can now go towards my working thesis. The thesis that I have for close reading is the analysis that stems from close reading can bring to light specifics that may have not been clear without careful examination. And after I've established what my working thesis is, I can now go into my main paragraphs. Now that I've established what my thesis is, I can now move on to the first paragraph. So in this first paragraph, I might want to set up what are some prerequisites or even the minute first steps as to what close reading is. And I'm going to want to start as simple as possible. So that can be such as finding something to close read. And like I said before, close reading doesn't have to simply be limited to texts or books. It can be something like a movie or even a text message from your girlfriend. After you've acquired something to close read, you're going to want to break it up into more manageable parts. And around this step, it would be good to include some disclaimers about this. So one disclaimer that I could give is that even though you're breaking up into different parts, you should review it as a whole, but it will go on to explain that close reading specifically targets those individual elements. So you shouldn't be trying to close read an entire thing of text because that is extremely overwhelming to a person. Along with my prerequisites, I'm going to have 6 steps as to how to close read that I've listed on the screen. How I choose to split up these different steps within the 3 body paragraphs is completely dependent on my stylistic choice. In theory, you also could split these steps into their own individual paragraphs. You can divide them 3 steps into each paragraph and have the prerequisites be its own paragraph, but each thing is going to differ between person to person and subject to subject, so it's not always going to be the same, and how I choose to do it will probably be different from how you might do it. So starting with the first step that I give is reading through the portion. Obviously, because I have nothing to define in this section, obviously everyone knows how to read and what reading through a section means. I can otherwise establish what the goal of this step is. And for this step, it is obviously to familiarize yourself with this section. You want to read through this part without any particular elements in mind. However, you do want to keep your eye on anything that kind of stands out to you. So unlike my previous step, my next step, which is scope and argument, kind of introduces new ideas that my reader may or may not know. So I'm going to want to begin by defining what scope and argument is. So for scope, in essence, it's going to be the topic of this section, the extent of application. And once I figure out what the subject of this piece is, I'm going to want to talk about some preconceptions, some stereotypes or beliefs that may be tied to that topic. And after I figure out the topic and all the things associated with it, I'm going to want to consider argument. So argument is usually what the author stands for in this section, and it's closely related to scope, and once I figure out what the underlying argument is, I might question the author's intention with providing this information. Along with my steps, I'm going to want to include evidence to support my claims. So for scope and argument, I included an excerpt from Pride and Prejudice. At first glance, this might be extremely overwhelming to try to discern, and you might not know where to start. Just from the opening lines alone, it is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in watch of the wife gives us our scope. It is about marriage at the time period, but the argument is a little hard to discern just from that. However, a truth universally acknowledged is a very bold statement to be making, and obviously there are going to be exceptions to this, such as the main character, if you've ever read Pride and Prejudice, who does not believe in this mentality, and thus you might question why Austen is making this kind of statement in the very beginning of the novel, and thus maybe consider that she's not being entirely serious and is poking fun at this mentality. With this example, you really want to walk your readers through how to apply this kind of information. Now moving on to the next step that I provided was characters and perspective. And while I don't really need to define what characters or perspective are, one of the things that might happen is my reader may not understand what this step entails. They might be questioning, well, what about the characters and perspectives? How is that a next step? And so you're going to want to elaborate what you specifically need to do within these kind of steps. So obviously when I say characters and perspective, you're going to want to consider who is involved, and not only who they are, but the things that they're doing, how they are as people, and what they're specifically feeling in that moment. And with perspective, I could go on to be like, is the main character the narrator? And thus when you find that out, it might give some more ideas of what kind of perspective it is, whether it be first, second, or third, because this information can provide you more insight on what's being offered. Much like my scope and argument step, I included an example from A Christmas Carol that explicitly describes Scrooge as a person. Although I've heavily marked up this section, one thing to note is that all of the adjectives and metaphors used to describe him are extremely uncomfortable kind of things, and the fact that he embodies all these things explains why he's solitary as an oyster, because no one's going to want to be around someone who makes them that uncomfortable. It is also worthy to note that this is told from a third person's point of view. You might not know where to take that, but if you consider maybe why it is, maybe it is the fact that he is so unpleasant, so unfriendly, that he doesn't even want to associate with us as readers and tell his story. There are a lot of things that you can take away from the section just considering those two things, and although it might be overwhelming, you might start to notice a pattern. So my next step would be the reliability of the narrator. Along with defining terms and specifying what the specific step has to talk about, I might want to talk about why this step is important. So with the reliability, it can come on to affect the meaning of what is being expressed throughout the entire story, or even just this simple section, along with leading questions as to why you should trust the narrator. You might also want to consider why they were chosen to be the narrator of this piece. The example I give for this one is actually a comparison between two different characters, between Ponyboy from The Outsiders and Nick Carraway from The Great Gatsby. Ponyboy, despite his name, is extremely reliable. Not only is his character very tried and true and very chivalrous, he also uses his story as a means of records. He's writing it for his English class, and he has no reason to lie about it. Whereas Nick is extremely unreliable. He's retelling these events of this crazy man that he once knew in a therapy session, and it calls into question his sanity and whether or not what he's saying means anything to the reader. So the next step that I list out is called diction. Diction is specifically the selection of words and phrases that are used. These words can have metaphorical or literal associations with ideas, and it's usually used to establish tone, styles, and even the theme. This step is actually used throughout all the other steps. If you noticed in my Pride and Prejudice example, I note the specific language that is being used, certain vocabulary that is being invoked, as well as in Scrooge's example of all the adjectives that he is used to describe by and the comparisons that he is being used. Those are all diction. And even though this step is used throughout the entire things, I specifically want to cite it in my example to make it more clear to the reader who may not understand what diction is. So the example that I give for diction is an excerpt from Romeo and Juliet. It's Juliet's monologue on the balcony before Romeo appears. Although I will not be reading out this example, you may note that I have circled the repetition of the word name along with the repetition of what's blank. And repetition is often associated with diction. However, it's not limited to repetition alone. I could know why she notes specific vocabulary, why she calls a name her enemy. I may talk about why she uses a rose as an example and further elaborate the meaning behind these choice of words and how they might play into bigger ideas that could thus support things like theme. Now we have reached the end of the process, and for close reading, our final step was identifying the theme and specifically the patterns that have been displayed through previous steps. So all of those previous steps that we've gone over are thus going to lead to this, and this is going to be your final step that thus is going to complete what you're specifically trying to explain to your reader. And although we have touched on how the theme plays in different steps, this is where you're kind of going to tie it together. And once you tie it together, you're ready to move on to your conclusion. Now that you've elaborated on all your steps and you've provided evidence for them, you might be asking yourself, well, what's next? How do I do the conclusion? And like any conclusion, you're first going to start off by restating your thesis. Specifically in different words, but for my scenario, I am just going to restate my previous thesis, which is the analysis that stems from close reading can bring to light specifics that may have not been clear without careful examination. And once I've restated that, my purpose of the conclusion is to attempt to reach a little further than what I've applied in this essay. So this is mainly looking at one small scope, but one way that I could take my conclusion is stating why this is important in the real world. Like, for example, I could say this doesn't have to be strictly significant in just an academic field. It can be applied to anything, and we need close reading in all aspects in order to understand a deeper meaning behind things, such as texts or movies, or even something as serious as like legal writing. So it's something that we should all know, and I'm arguing that everyone should know close reading, and despite how misleading some of the information about it may be. And from there, that is the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening, and good luck on your writing.